Hello cruel world, my name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. So what are the specific challenges of working as a psychiatrist in prison? What is SPICE and why is it so popular in prison? I'm going to answer these questions and more in this episode. This is part 4 of 4 in a series about prison and mental health. You should go and check out the other 3 episodes. I assess a whole range of issues, including why mental illness is so rife in prison, the kind of setup of treating it, so clinics versus healthcare units, and I also talk about some of my anonymised real life cases. I also talk about the very tragic suicide of a young woman named Sarah Reed, who killed herself in prison in 2016, where she was aged only 31. She strangled herself. So I'm about to tell you about a real life patient. As always, I've anonymised the prisoner. I've changed some of the demographic details so she's less easily identifiable. The lady that I'm talking about is Ms. D. I saw her in about mid-2017. She was a middle-aged Brazilian woman and she'd been charged with stalking and assaulting a man who worked in a local clothes shop. They struck up some sort of friendship. She got his number. They sent each other some flirty texts, but then it quickly turned a bit intense. Miss D was sending declarations of love, but then threatening to behead him, and then marriage proposals. So I think it's fair to say it was mixed messages. Should we put it like that? One night she followed him into a bar while she was wearing a disguise and she hid in the corner. She was basically stalking him. He was sat with some friends, and when he started chatting to a young woman after a couple of hours, Miss D got up, walked towards him, threw a bar stool at him and accused him of cheating. I mean, they say all is fair in love and war, but I think that's probably little consolation to the victim. So Ms. D was placed on remand in prison, which is where I encountered her. I offered her a couple of appointments in my clinic and Ms. D did not wish to attend. She ignored my appointment requests. She ignored everybody around her and she would only eat packaged food. I actually saw her in the main prison, and when I very first met her, she denied that she was herself, and she also talked about herself in the third person. I found her to be very confrontational and angry. So when I saw Ms. D, there was very little background information available about her. I didn't even know where she lived. Although when I spoke to her, even though she was very guarded and defensive, I got bits of information from her. So for example, I found out that she lived in Slough. Now for our foreign viewers, Slough is an area in Berkshire in the south of England. It is actually quite near where I was born. And Slough is famous for its greyness, smog and grey smog. And I found out a little bit about her social circumstances. I found out she used to work as a pet therapist. Hopefully her animal skills were better than her people skills. But then interestingly, she got really aggressive and agitated when I asked her about her mental health. She waved her fist at me and she threatened to shove my beard up my arse. So I thought, not a very pleasant makeover, so I left her alone. I asked the prison officers about her and they didn't describe any overt symptoms such as Ms. D expressing delusional beliefs, but there was some slightly odd behaviour, like she was staring into space for hours at a time. So I wasn't 100% sure, but I was fairly convinced that she was psychotic. And unfortunately, people like this can fester in prison for months or even years because they're not loud and they don't cause problems, so they're kind of ignored. What's the phrase? The squeakiest wheel gets the oil. I like that saying, and I think it's very much relevant in this situation. So I thought she was psychotic, but the struggle was to persuade her local forensic psychiatrist services and my psychiatric peers in the Slough area to accept her into hospital. So initially they kept batting the referral back, saying that her choosing not to engage in conversation was not necessarily mental illness and they wanted to see more positive evidence of psychosis. So I have mentioned in other videos that it's a real struggle to get people into these forensic psychiatric units, really long waiting lists. And part of the reason is because they're overstretched, they don't have enough beds, but also when you take somebody under a special criminal section, the process of being rehabilitated in these units is long and it's arduous. People are in there for months, often years, sometimes even decades. It's not something you can do lightly. It takes a lot of effort and paperwork and convincing the Ministry of Justice or the judge to actually get them in the first place. So it's not a decision that's taken lightly. I think in this case, another issue was that the offence that she committed wasn't really that serious. I imagine if she was on remand for murder or attempted murder, then the psychiatric services would have had a lower threshold to admit her. Basically, I sorted out this problem by constantly referring her every few days. After around 4 months, the services near Slough finally admitted her. Their clinical justification was that because Ms D had not engaged or had a conversation with anybody for 4 months, this is more indicative of potential mental illness than only for a few weeks when I first referred her. Although, to be honest, I felt a bit like Andy Dufresne from Shawshank Redemption. They wanted me to stop writing to them and stop phoning them and just to shut me up, basically. Either way, it worked. She was sent to hospital, eventually treated and rehabilitated. I'd like to officially introduce you to this channel. This is a Psych for Sore Minds, hosted by me, Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts and in prisons and psychiatric units. I've got hundreds, if not thousands, of fascinating stories that I'd love to share with you. In my videos, I talk about a range of diagnoses. I talk about some true life, high profile crime cases where there's an angle to do with mental illness. Go check out some of my videos. I interview ex-patients. There's something for everybody on this channel. The question is, what are the challenges of working as a psychiatrist in prison? So specifically, I'm going to talk about the clinical aspects of my job. In previous episodes, I've talked about the pros and cons of my role versus other types of environments for forensic psychiatrists like hospital. But what I'm about to tell you is different. This is about the ins and outs of my everyday working, if that makes sense. Hopefully that all makes sense to you. Maybe I should just shut up and tell you what I mean. Here are the problems. Problem number one, lack of background information of the prisoners. So when I worked in hospital, first of all, you'd have a lot of time with each individual patient. And usually, even if the notes aren't there when they were first admitted, you'd get them within a week. And you'd rely on the help of the admin staff who you knew. I had a personal secretary, I'd see her every day and I could ask her to chase things up for me. However, in prison, you're relying on reception staff that work in another part of the prison. Sometimes you don't even interact with them. And often you don't have background information on the prisoners. Or you do, but it takes months to get there. So why is this a problem? Well, it makes it a lot harder to diagnose. I'll give you some real life examples. The prisoner who's just met you for the first time might not necessarily tell you about trauma, especially say female prisoner doesn't want to talk to a man about sexual assault unless she's formed some sort of comfortable therapeutic relationship with them. So if you don't have that information, you could miss the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Other prisoners have very complicated psychiatric diagnoses, and they may have had multiple assessments in the past. It might have taken a lot of time and a lot of psychiatrists to actually sort out what the diagnosis is. So without access to the notes, you're basically starting from scratch. You're starting from square one. You're duplicating work. Or similarly, a prisoner might have tried several different types of antidepressants, might have tried different combinations, might have tried different doses over the years, and finally found a regime that actually works. But quite often they can't remember what that regime is, can't remember the names of the medication. So again, without the notes, you're starting at square one. Often, another challenge is that patients who are quietly psychotic in prison can fester behind bars because they're not observed by nurses. So people don't know that they're unwell. They're just living in their cells really paranoid. And guards just think they're a bit standoffish. They think it's the prisoner's attitude. Another problem of working in a prison, or another challenge, and I kind of just touched on this, is that there's no nursing observation. So prison guards are not very good at spotting mental illness. There are so many inmates that present with aggression and violence that they can't tell if it's caused by psychosis, such as hearing voices or paranoid delusions. Unlike hospitals, where the nurses observe patients and the nurses have training in mental health symptoms, so they're better at eliciting them than prison guards. Another challenge in prisons is generally the communication is very poor. So I said this before in a previous video when talking about pros and cons of working in a hospital. In a hospital, you have a set team, a multidisciplinary team, and we meet at least once a week in the ward round, and sometimes other times in shorter, smaller meetings. So every week I would speak to the psychologist, the social worker, the nurses, the occupational therapist. Everybody was on the same page, everyone knew the plan. Sometimes there were a difference of opinions, but that's kind of the point of this forum. So we discuss what our recommendations are and we work out together what to do. Everybody knows the plan. Whereas in prison, you're kind of relying on people that you don't directly work with. And from my experience, it can be very disjointed and disorganized. So for example, there are meetings where other external agencies are supposed to attend, but very frequently they just didn't turn up. Another issue is that the caseloads are much bigger in prison. So in a secure hospital, I would typically be responsible for 12 patients that were inpatients there, and I had full responsibility for them whilst they were on the ward. And they didn't really move around, they were always on the ward unless they were having a visitor or going on leave. Whereas in prison, it's a much huger building environment, there's a lot more movement, and I might be responsible for 40 or 50 patients at one time. I give them appointments and they might come to they just don't turn up. Sometimes I don't see them for weeks, sometimes the appointment gets lost, sometimes the appointment clashes with their work or a visit, and I don't know that when I'm making the appointment, nobody tells me. The prisoner just doesn't turn up. I have to say I was relatively lucky. When I previously worked in a large female prison, it was pretty well organised. It was well managed. Whereas in men's prisons, especially ones that I've got colleagues that work in, the caseload is so high and the waiting list is so long for them just to see individual prisoners that it takes them several weeks. Even if the prisoner is unwell, even if the prisoner is deemed high priority, it still takes several weeks to see them. Another issue is faking mental illness. So quite a lot of prisoners exaggerate or fake mental illness because they want to get tablets, such as antipsychotics that give them a buzz or sedatives. In fact, some prisons have a blanket ban on certain medications. For example, zopiclone, which is a sleeping tablet, or Valium, otherwise known as diazepam, which is an anti-anxiety tablet, typical choice of tipple for the housewives in the 70s and 80s. Sometimes prisoners on the streets have been on Valium for years, either prescribed Valium or bought it illegally from the streets. So they're addicted to it and they go into prison, then they go into withdrawal. Sometimes they're very agitated. I've seen prisoners who are really angry with me personally for not prescribing Valium, but I literally can't do it. It's not on the computerized prescribing medical system in the prison. So we have to think about alternative, less addictive, but less powerful sedatives. From my experience of working as a forensic psychiatrist, this doesn't happen so much in the hospital. There isn't so much faking it. Broadly speaking, it's because people in hospital don't have insight, plus they have to prove that they're well before they can eventually leave. So they don't want to be treated or medicated. They usually don't want extra medication. Whereas in prison, broadly speaking, it's the opposite. They're already in prison for a certain amount of time to be punished. And if they do have a mental illness, it's generally not that severe compared to hospital, because if they do have a mental illness in prison, they'll be in the healthcare unit, and that's only a small number of people. So generally, and again, this is a big generalization, a lot of prisoners weren't that ill, but they just wanted certain medications that give them a buzz, so they would sometimes fake mental illness. I'll tell you another odd, kind of unexpected challenge that I used to face in prisons, which is this: sometimes prisoners just disappear. I'm not talking about chipping away with a rock hammer on their wall, hiding it behind a poster, and then crawling through half a mile of sewage. What I mean is sometimes they're just transferred to another prison. Say if they've got multiple criminal charges and all the charges are combined together, the court is in a different part of the country, the prisoner might get transferred. Sometimes the charges are dropped, say if a witness withdraws their statement or if there's witness intimidation. Sometimes the prisoner has already been on remand and they've been found guilty, but the time served in prison on remand counts towards their sentence, so they're released from court. Most of these things happen in court, and the prisoner will suddenly disappear, and most of the time we're not even told about it. The psychiatrist has no say, compared to, for example, a hospital where, as the team leader, I would generally have some sort of input, or at least be informed of every major decision. As I've said before, communication in prisons can be very poor. Sometimes we're not even told when our individual prisoners are going to court, let alone that they're about to be released. It just happens. So one week I'll do a ward round on the healthcare unit and I'll see a very ill patient, and the next week they've disappeared. And it can be quite frustrating because sometimes I've prescribed a antidepressant medication and I want to monitor the benefits or the side effects so I know how to adjust the dose. Or maybe the psychologist in our team has started a new form of therapy with a prisoner and it all feels like a waste of the time because the prisoner just disappears. So yeah, it can be frustrating. Another very common, very dangerous issue in prison that you've probably heard of is spice. So I had heard of spice before I started working in prisons, but I had no idea idea it was this rife. Spice is a nasty synthetic cannabinoid, also known as a novel psychoactive substance. When I say spice, I'm talking about all the different versions of it as well. I think Black Mamba is a well-known one. So spice is very popular in prison, especially over the last 5 years. It's kind of accelerated exponentially because it's cheap compared to, for example, cannabis. It's easy to smuggle in because the smell isn't as easily detected, for example, with sniffer dogs who sniff in visitors. Drug tests are less likely to detect them. So drug tests don't have the right, is it antibody, is that the right word, to detect a lot of these new novel psychoactive substances. And when the people that make the tests adapt the tests, some clever devious chemist somewhere makes a new substrate of the chemical so that it's not picked up in tests. So they're constantly evading the tests faster than we can make them. Spice can make some people extremely paranoid. It can even make people psychotic. I've seen several cases of people becoming completely psychotic when they've taken it. And I can understand why people take recreational drugs. I go to festivals, I occasionally go to raves. In my prime years, I used to go clubbing a lot. I have friends who like to indulge and everybody seems happy. But spice, at least the people I've seen, as I say, they become quite agitated. Sometimes they become physically unwell. I've seen people having seizures. I've seen people being sick, as I said, intense psychosis. And I've seen at least a dozen cases of prisoners, most of them men, who have ended up in a horrific state after taking spice. I've even seen people intentionally self-harm because they're so agitated, like banging their heads against their cell walls. Personally, I'm not too keen on recreational seizures. I think I'll stick to my gin and tonic. Thank you very much. Okay, so that is the end of my 4-part series. Watch out for future videos. Got loads of high-profile criminal cases I want to talk about. As always, I will answer your questions and other questions from the internet. That's what I do. That's what I'm about. All that remains is for me to unceremoniously beg for you to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it acts like a deterrent for those pesky wasps. I'll be very interested to hear your experiences, especially about prison. Have you ever been there? Have you ever visited? If so, what are your thoughts on your mental health or other people's mental health? And how was your experience or experience of people that you know accessing psychiatrists or mental health whilst in prison? You can hit me up in the usual social media channels, including Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Spread the love and tell your favourite people about this here channel because they deserve to know about it. Before I go, I will quickly mention that, as you will know if you're a regular viewer, I'm going to be a guest speaker at CrimeCon UK. Woo-hoo. So this is a huge crime convention, massive in the States, coming over to the UK for the first time. It will be in London, 25th and 26th of September. You will hear about lots of different true crime, from serial killers, unsolved crimes. You will hear from criminologists, law enforcement agents, and your favourite podcasters will be there. I will be doing a talk about 2 real-life cases of people that I've personally assessed that have killed their own family members. One who was mentally ill, one who wasn't. If you are a true crime enthusiast, you have to cop tickets. You cannot miss out. Use the link below to get your tickets. You can use the code PSYCH for a 10% discount. Until next time, spread the love, stay euthymic. Please do not forget, I love you.